Okay, why don't we begin, and we'll finish up this series of lectures on the cognitive perspective on social interaction. Mostly, so far, I've been talking in the abstract about how cognition is supposed to be involved in social interaction. We got concrete in one instance with the so-called Pygmalion in the classroom experiment, and that does illustrate the basic point that people's expectations, an individual's expectations about a situation can lead to behavior that brings the situation in line with the expectations. That's one way of revealing the role of cognitions in social interaction. And I want to talk about a couple more experiments that demonstrate this today. Some of these are classic experiments in social psychology. And I have to say at the outset that I carry around in my head a little what I call a Faustian list of experiments that I would sell my soul to have done. And you're going to see two of these today, which probably says as much about me as about the experiments, but I really love these experiments. In any event, let's go back to where we ended up last time. What the self-fulfilling prophecy is a specific instance of is a broader class of effects known as expectancy confirmation effects. And these expectancy confirmation effects come in two basic forms: behavioral confirmation and perceptual confirmation. What you saw in the Pygmalion in the classroom experiment is an example of behavioral confirmation, where the teachers had expectancies about their students, and they behaved in such a manner towards their students as to elicit from the students behavior, objectively observable behavior, like test scores, that confirms the teacher's expectations. Those are the most dramatic examples of the self-fulfilling prophecy. But there's another class of these effects, and they're known as perceptual confirmation effects. And here, the behavior of the target in response to the perceiver's expectations is more ambiguous. It's not completely clear whether the student is smart or stupid or whatever, but the behavior is ambiguous enough that it can give rise to an interpretation of the behavior that is congruent with the teacher's expectations. So again, what happens in the behavioral confirmation experiments is that the perceiver's expectations influence the person's actual behavior, which changes the objective situation. In perceptual the confirmation, the perceiver's expectations influence the perceiver's own interpretation of this ambiguous stimulus information. Yes? Hostile attribution bias, for those of you who know what that is, yeah, that would be a really good example of this. There's a series of famous experiments in social psychology employing what's known as the Donald study. It's a story. It's a story about a guy named Donald who does a whole bunch of things that are kind of ambiguous, but you can interpret them as hostile behaviors. And perceivers who think that Donald is a hostile guy are more likely to interpret his behaviors as examples of hostility as opposed to something else. So yes, that's a good example of what these are all about. You're not going to see one of those examples today. You're going to see other examples. Like this famous experiment by Mark Snyder, University of Minnesota, and Bill Swan, now at the University of Texas. Swan was Snyder's graduate student in what's known as the noise gun experiment, a wonderful, interesting experiment on behavioral confirmation effects. What happened in this experiment was that Snyder and Swan brought subjects into the laboratory for an experiment on reaction times, perhaps the most boring imaginable topic in psychological research, but an extremely important method and one that psychologists of all stripes use. The subjects came in, there were three of them initially, and just as to kind of fill up some time, they completed some personality checklists, and then they were introduced to the reaction time apparatus, where they were supposed to watch for a target appearing on a computer screen, and whenever they saw this target, they were supposed to punch a clicker to indicate their reaction time. And what Snyder and Swan said to the subjects was, this is a pretty boring experiment, and we understand that. So just to make it interesting, what we're going to do is you're going to take turns at this reaction time apparatus, and one of you who's not at the reaction time apparatus is going to sit at this apparatus, and it's a noise gun, and what you're going to be able to do, a noise weapon rather, and what you're going to be able to do is to send a blast of white noise into the booth in which is sitting the guy at the reaction time apparatus, and you can use this noise weapon to disrupt his reaction time, interfere with his response. And again, just to make it interesting, we're going to make this a contest, and the guy who gets the shortest overall reaction time is going to get a prize. So you set up some competition between the two of them. So then two of these subjects are selected at random. There are no Confederates in this experiment. It's one of the beauties of this experiment. There are no Confederates in the experiment. Two of the subjects are still selected at random. One sent to the reaction time apparatus. One sent to the noise weapon apparatus. The third subject is told, well, your partner hasn't arrived yet, so we're going to just want you to wait for a while. We'll fit you into the experiment later. So we've just got these two people. First one, known as the labeling perceiver, and when he's seated at the noise weapon, the experimenter goes in and says, gee, I just looked at the personality questionnaires you guys just filled out, and I want you to know the guy who's in there, he's really pretty hostile. Okay? Or in another condition of the experiment, they didn't say anything about hostility. So this subject is known as the labeling perceiver because he's been encouraged to view the target as a hostile person or not. Then they go into the room where the target is. They go into the reaction time apparatus room and they say, okay, we're about to start. And in one condition, they say, don't be too concerned about how you behave in this. It's really just a game, and people tend to behave in line with the situation that they're in. In another condition of the experiment, the targets were encouraged to make dispositional attributions of their own behavior. The experimenter went into the room and said, okay, we're going to start in a minute, and we hope you find this interesting because it turns out that the way people behave in this experiment is very revealing of the kind of person that they are. Okay, so you get the setup, and now we're into phase one of the experiment, where these two subjects, the labeling perceiver and the target, are going to take turns, alternate at the reaction time apparatus and the noise gun apparatus. Lots of trials here, and we're just going to look at the first block of 3 trials, where the labeling perceiver is seated at the noise weapon, and the target is seated at the reaction time apparatus. And what we want to know is, what does the labeling perceiver do to the target? Okay, and the answer is that the labeling perceiver, anticipating an interaction with a hostile partner, inflicts more noise on the target if he perceives. Sorry, I'm trying to deal with this here. But inflicts more noise on the subject if he perceives them as a hostile individual than if he perceives them as a non-hostile individual. Here is the beginning of the self-fulfilling prophecy. The labeling perceiver, thinking that the target is a hostile person, treats him as if he were a hostile person by sending a louder blast of noise at this individual. So now this goes on for a while. Phase one that continues, and what happens is the subjects now exchange places. The target, who used to be seated at the reaction time apparatus, is now seated at the noise weapon, and the labeling perceiver, who was seated at who was originally seated at the noise weapon, is now seated at the reaction time apparatus. And this gives the target an opportunity to retaliate against the labeling perceiver. which, in fact, he does. Okay? So what we've got here is, if the target's been labeled as hostile, he inflicts more noise on the labeling perceiver now than if he had been labeled as non-hostile, and there's no difference between targets who were encouraged to view their behavior as a reflection of their own personal dispositions and those targets who were encouraged to attribute their behavior to the situation that they're in. So now we've got two steps here. The labeling perceiver thinks the target's hostile, treats him as if he was hostile. That differential treatment has now elicited hostile behavior from the target. Okay, the target is now fulfilling this particular prophecy, and then things go on for a while. Phase one continues. They alternate back and forth for 7 more blocks of 3 trials each, and at the end of this phase of the experiment, the labeling perceiver is asked to rate the target's personality, and what you can see is that the labeling perceiver does, in fact, rate the target as more hostile if he was encouraged to view that target as hostile than if he had been encouraged to view him as non-hostile. Again, this is exactly what you'd expect, given what we know about things like the self-fulfilling prophecy. The labeling perceiver has elicited behavior from the target that confirms the perceiver's expectations. Okay, so now what happens is that we now move into the second phase of this experiment. Remember that third subject? Okay, well now it's his turn. Okay, the labeling perceiver is now dismissed from the experiment. The target continues in the experiment with this new subject who's not told anything about what's gone on in the past. So we're going to call him the naive perceiver. He's not been encouraged to label the target in any way. Again, when the experimenter talks to the target, he tries to reinforce these self-attributions. Remember, it's getting interesting. This is revealing the kind of person you really are, or it's just a matter of the situation. Again, the subjects are taking turns, and on the first trial here, the target is seated at the noise weapon, and the naive perceiver is seated at the reaction time apparatus. So now what we want to know is, how does the target behave with this new person, a person who knows nothing about what went on before? Yes? No, he's been sitting reading a magazine in another room or something like that. He has no idea what's been going on. He's naive. He's a naive perceiver. And what you can see here is that, in fact, targets treat the naive perceiver, in a sense, in accordance with the way that they themselves were treated. If the target was encouraged to make a dispositional self-attribution, that is, encouraged to attribute his behavior in the previous phase of the experiment to the kind of person he is, he now inflicts more noise on the naive perceiver than if he had been initially labeled as non-hostile. So what you're seeing here is the persistence of the target's hostile, aggressive behavior into the second phase of the experiment with a naive perceiver. Okay? But only in the condition where the target was encouraged to view his own behavior as a reflection of the kind of person he is. When the targets were given a situational attribution for their behavior, there's essentially no difference between the two conditions. They start out fresh. They say, oh, okay, it's a new situation, it's a new guy, I don't know anything about this person, and their behavior is more balanced. What goes on in this experiment then is that the target's behavior, which had been elicited by the labeling perceiver to begin with, continues with the naive perceiver, but again, only in this condition where the target has been encouraged to make a dispositional attribution for his own behavior. Let me finish this experiment and then we'll go on. Okay, so now phase 2 continues for 7 more blocks each, with the target and the naive perceiver taking turns again. And then finally, this should say naive perceiver rates the target. And what you can see here is that the naive perceiver now also rates the target as a hostile person. That's this difference, but again, only in the self-attributional condition. What's gone on here is that the target's hostility is both perceived by the labeling perceiver, but also perceived by the naive perceiver, because in fact, in this dispositional condition, the targets have behaved hostilely. They have behaved in a hostile manner, but the behavior of the target has been created out of whole cloth by the labeling perceiver. Okay? You can see how this transaction now is going on. So what you're getting here in Snyder's very nice phrase is that belief is creating reality. The labeling perceiver's belief about the target has made the target into something that he wasn't before. The labeling perceiver, believing the target is hostile, treats the target as hostile, elicits hostile behavior from the target, behavior that persists with a new individual in this condition where the target has been encouraged to believe about himself that his behavior is a reflection of his own dispositions and tendencies. Whether individuals regard their beliefs as assumptions or as hypotheses, whether their beliefs concern themselves or other people, social beliefs can and do channel the remembering of past events and the unfolding of future events in ways that determine both the subjective and objective reality of their beliefs. That's the essential statement of these expectancy confirmation effects. Now you had a question. No, they're not. That's actually a myth that is perpetrated by certain nefarious social psychologists. And I'm going to talk about that later in the course. It's actually not true that people are bad at making situational attributions and disposed to make dispositional attributions. That's a phenomenon known as the fundamental attribution error. It's been around for a long time, and it has been grossly exaggerated. But don't make me go through that now. I'll do it later. It was a wrong way to think about attributions. Okay, and if you think about what we talked about earlier with Kurt Lewin, okay, this dichotomy. Okay, I'm going to do it. You're making me do it. This is bad. This dichotomy between the personal and the environmental, the person and the situation, is a false dichotomy. Okay, it's a false dichotomy because people are part of the situations to which they respond. Okay, and people create the situations to which they respond. And arguments about the fundamental attribution error don't understand this. Okay, and made a mistake, exaggerated the fundamental attribution error precisely because of what was essentially a misreading of Lewin, and as we'll find out a little bit later, Heider. As somebody once put it, and we don't know exactly who said this first. I wish it had been me, but it wasn't. The fundamental attribution error isn't an error, but it is fundamental. Okay, and if you think about things from a psychological point of view, all attributions go to the person. Okay, because as psychologists, we believe that the person's behavior is determined by his or her mental states. Okay, it's not the situation that causes behavior; it's the perception of the situation that causes behavior, and that's what we've been talking about here. So that's much more than I had any right to say. But okay, yes. It only had, well, you only see it clearly in phase 2 because it's a new situation, okay? And there's really no reason for the target to generalize from how he was treated by the labeling perceiver to how he's going to deal with the naive perceiver. So that generalization, that transfer from phase 1 to phase 2 is really only going to happen if the person believes that what he's doing is a reflection of what he's really like, okay? That's a dispositional condition. That's the story there. One more very quick question, then I got to go on. Well, there is did they actually measure hostility like as a personality characteristic? Yes, and by virtue of random assignment, there were no differences among these subjects. Yeah, you may have noticed there are some hostile college students out there. These are college students in this experiment. But from one condition to another, by virtue of random assignment, there were no systematic differences in hostility. So that's why I said earlier, this hostile behavior was created out of whole cloth by the way the targets were treated at the outset by the labeling perceiver. Okay, so let's go on here. Again, what you're seeing, just to review, is beliefs creating reality. The labeling perceivers had beliefs about the targets, and they behaved accordingly. Their behavior elicited behavior from the targets that corresponded to the perceiver's beliefs, and the target's behavior persisted into a new situation with a new target, given their own beliefs about themselves. So again, what you're getting illustrated in this experiment are two important facts. Beliefs about other people are powerful determinants of behavior, but so are beliefs about ourselves. So now let's turn to this next part, beliefs about ourselves, and see what happens there. Yeah, I can do this. A quick demonstration of this is by a lovely experiment by James Hilton and John Darley. Hilton was Darley's student at Princeton, using another favorite procedure of social psychologists known as the getting acquainted paradigm. And in this paradigm, you bring two subjects who don't know each other into the laboratory, and you ask them just to get to know each other. Sometimes one subject is a confederate of the experimenter. In this experiment, neither of them are confederates. They're real people getting acquainted for the first time, and they're simply asked to talk with each other for a while about a set of topics, the kinds of things that college students talk about. And what happened in this experiment is that Hilton and Darley identified one of these two subjects as the perceiver, and went to the perceiver and in one condition say, oh, this should be a really interesting study because we got some personality data on you guys, and the person you're working with is kind of cold. Right? And then in the other condition, there was no information at all. But then they went into the target, okay? And in one condition, they didn't do anything to the target. In the other condition, they said, I don't know where he got this idea, but the guy you're dealing with today thinks you're cold. All right? So now there's an unconstrained interaction. They just talk, they deal with each other a little bit, and then after a period of time, the perceivers rate the targets. And what you can see here is that in the target naive condition, where the targets are told nothing about what the perceiver thinks about them, in fact, the perceivers, the perceivers rate these naive targets as a lot colder than ones that they didn't get the label at all. But in the informed condition, where they went into the target and said, gee, I don't know where he got this idea, but he thinks you're kind of cold, what happened was that the targets engaged in behavior intended to counteract that impression, deliberately tried to persuade the person that they weren't cold, that they were warm and gregarious and extroverted and all these kinds of things, so that the perceivers now, ratings of coldness are a lot more even-handed. So it's not the case, an impression that you might have gotten from the Pygmalion in the classroom experiment, that perceivers are kind of leaves blown around by the wind of the targets are kind of leaves blown around by the wind of a perceiver's expectations. It's not the case at all that when targets have some sense of what's going on, they're able to manage the impression that the perceiver is forming of them. They're able to engage in behavior that will shape the perceiver's expectations and maybe even contradict them. Now, this was a very small experiment. A much more interesting experiment was done by Bill Swan himself. This is known in the trade as the Mastermind experiment because I've used a familiar party game, Mastermind, as the medium. Anybody play Mastermind anymore? Yeah, it's a good game, right? It's a cool game, right? Everybody should play Mastermind, all right? It's better than some of the things you can do on weekends. But in any event, what Swan and Hill did was to bring subjects into the laboratory. This just happened to be women, not for any reason, just happened to be that way. At the outset of the experiment, the subjects may complete a little personality questionnaire in which they gave self-ratings of dominance. And this was intended to find out what the women's self-concept, what the women's impressions of themselves were like. Do they see themselves as dominant versus submissive? Then what they're done is they're paired with the partner to oppose the experimenter in a game of Mastermind. Now, in fact, in this particular experiment, the partner that these women are paired with is actually a confederate of the experimenter. He's going to be behaving in accordance with a prearranged script. But again, as in the noise gun experiment, the people are going to alter in the role of leader and assistant. So one of these women, on each turn with the Mastermind game, is going to make the decision as to how to play the game, what move to make next. So that's, again, a very common social psychological situation to engage two people in playing some sort of game and then see how the interaction evolves and what they make of each other. Okay, so that's basically what happens in this experiment, is that the subjects and the confederates, unbeknownst to them, confederates, alternate in this game, trying to make various kinds of moves. Then what happens is that in phase 2, the partners are given the opportunity to choose the leader for the next phase of the game. They've kind of gotten a sense of how each of them plays the game, and then they're supposed to choose. What happens in this phase is that the confederate now gives the subject false feedback about his or her impressions of personality. She'll say to the subject, "Why don't you be the leader? You seem to be the forceful, dominant type." Okay, or doesn't say anything like that. So either the confederate identifies the subject as the forceful, dominant type of person or not. And in this experiment, what they did was to cross experimentally how the partner identified the subject with the subject's own self-concept. So here you have subjects who think of themselves as dominant or submissive, and subjects who are identified by the confederate as dominant or submissive.